Thinking about the ways medieval cathedrals were designed to work took me back to Otto von Simpson, the 1960s art historian, who reminded us that medieval church architects built metaphor. That is, they attempted, in building these churches, and failed, but never stopped trying, to build on earth what St. Augustine in the 15th century called the celestial city of God. This powerful realization of von Simpson's reunited for me buildings and maps, which are metaphors for the reality they represent. Remembering that the Latin for metaphor is translatio, which means a carrying across, set me to thinking about the literal and figurative access maps and buildings provide, and the ways floor plans, decorative programs, and furnishings work together to give church visitors the knowledge they needed to translate themselves from the imperfect earthly city of God to its perfect heavenly model, to move themselves toward what the 11th century monk, mapmaker, and mystic Hugh of St. Victor called salvific restoration. Church tabulae, or tables, aren't metaphors, but like cathedral buildings and maps, they were physically and figuratively positioned as intermediaries between church authorities and the faithful. These were painted, inscribed, or carved panels made of wood, metal, ivory, or stone, and were situated in church buildings and used to reiterate the church's retelling of Christianity's grand narrative. In short, they were meant to inform and inspire the faithful. Given that nearly all of these locals inspire the faithful. Given that nearly all of these locals and pilgrims were illiterate or semi-literate, these buildings, maps, and tablets, these tabulae, themselves needed human intermediaries, human guides, to ventriloquize their words and images. This is why David John Hall writes in his book on medieval pilgrimage that the search for an intermediary, a guide, was the real essence of medieval pilgrimage. And so what follows is about intermediation, translation, intercession, and intervention. First, I'll say a few things about the church building itself, and second, its once ubiquitous and now nearly disappeared tabulae, these tablets. I have some pretty pictures to show you too. In the third section, I'll come back to the Hereford Map, which, as I said, was made around 1300 in Hereford and positioned in the cathedral's north transept, its left arm in the north transept, to represent what one of its inscriptions calls in Old French, estorie. In medieval theology terms, this is historia, the human story that runs from Adam and Eve's expulsion to doomsday, to judgment day. The map shows viewers this story in over 1,000 inscriptions. Go back to this. In over 1,000 inscriptions and in nearly as many images. This foundational salvation narrative was the first story that every medieval person should have held in memory because all else was thought to grow from it. This map is huge. I said it's monumental. It's about nearly 6 feet tall and about 4 feet wide. It's all painted on one calf skin. So the apex, the top of the part, was the back of the calf's neck. So it's all from one animal. It's really pretty amazing. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas wrote, "Curiosity appeals to all the senses," and the churches in which I am interested met that appeal. Their crowded decorative and furnishing schemes would have made visiting England's 16 pre-Reformation cathedrals a multi-sensory, multimedia experience. Locals and visitors would have been unable to escape the intense odors of others, to say nothing of the animals wandering around in the building or the clouds of incense released to mask those odors. It really would have been pretty funky. They would have seen souvenirs and food being sold, masses offered at multiple altars, and would have heard disembodied priestly voices rising from the chantry chapels and the choir from which they were excluded. These proto-museums, these repositories of marvels, and I use this word in its 14th century sense of a miracle, an astonishing thing that causes surprise, admiration, and wonder. These repositories, these buildings, stage chapters from Historia in a variety of media. And they did this to trigger what Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis in Paris called the anagogical moment, that instant when gaze and intent turn heavenward, translating, as he wrote, the susceptible from that which is material to that which is immaterial. Click ahead here. Some of you have seen this before. As this reimagining of Hereford's north transept illustrates, the stone surfaces and architectural embellishments, chevrons, diapering, foiling, jambs, medallions, moldings, tracery, were elaborately polychrome, painted in many colors. Fantastic color reigned throughout the building, the entire church, in mural paintings on statuary and their niches, on rich textiles, many adorned with precious and semi-precious stones, on reliquaries, rood screens, tombs, shrines, pulpits, candelabra, windows, these tablets painted and mounted on walls and columns, and at Hereford on its map and triptych. So everything inside the building was covered in paint, colored in paint. To state the obvious, these buildings were marvelously over-furnished and sensorially overwhelming. They therefore ran the risk of misdirecting visitors' attention, thus the need for intermediation, for crowd control, guidance, and instructive intervention. These decorative programs made churches visitor attractions, medieval theme parks, if you like, so like Disneyland. Well, not like Disneyland. Universal Studios, maybe. Medieval theme parks, and English towns like Canterbury, Hereford, and Walsingham were really busy because their churches held important reliquaries. Overcrowding meant distraction, and cruciform, cross-shaped floor plans like this, which is from Hereford Cathedral, were a partial remedy, as they silently intervened to orient, literally point crowds to the east, funneling them toward the high altar and in the direction of Jerusalem. So all of these medieval churches are oriented in such a way that when you walk into the front door, which is west, on the west end, toward the main altar, you're walking toward Jerusalem, literally, to the east. And so these places teem with visitors, as this excerpt from Abbot Suger's book on the consecration of his church tells us. Suger, it's really pretty frightening, particularly the part about the distress of the women, which was so great and so intolerable that you could see with horror how they, squeezed in by the mass of strong men as in a winepress, exhibited bloodless faces as in imagined death. So it's not quite like Disneyland. In Hereford, so Suger rebuilt and enlarged the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis in Paris in part to solve this overcrowding problem. In Hereford, Bishop Richard Swinfield enlarged the cathedral's north and south choir aisles in the 13th century to accommodate and direct crowds eastward to the first tomb shrine of his mentor and episcopal predecessor, St. Thomas Cantilou. Decorative excess and ogling worried churchmen like the reformists Bernard of Clairvaux in France and Adam of Abbey-Dore in Western England. And so human and tabular, that is animate and inanimate guides, were important. Bernard's often quoted Apologia, that's what this is, rails against ogling and excess. And Adam wrote a treatise called Picture in Carmine to counter what he considered distracted ogling. Hereford Cathedral, which is about 11 miles from Abbey-Dore, had a copy of this treatise. These two Cistercian monks would have found an object lesson in the 15th century Tale of Baron, which used to be attributed to Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's collection features stories told by a group of pilgrims traveling southeastward from London to Canterbury Cathedral to pray, well, ideally to pray, at the shrine of Archbishop St. Thomas Becket, who was murdered there in 1170 by King Henry II's knights. They cut the top of his head off while he was kneeling at the altar. In the prologue to this story, we find Chaucer's knight, partner, and miller and pilgrimage host Harry Bailey in Canterbury Cathedral. This is kind of cool because Chaucer's pilgrims never get to Canterbury. He never finished the Canterbury Tales, so somebody after him managed to get the pilgrims down to Canterbury and put them in the church. These pilgrims take in the building's verbal and visual marvels and comically misread and misinterpret them. Aping their literate betters, they gawp at heraldic devices, shields, painted shields, as they try to determine who painted them and what they mean. Not surprisingly, what the tale calls the luid goths, the naive goats, draw conclusions as astute as those, as the tale says, of a horned ram. So they're no good at this. As he often does, Harry becomes exasperated with his charges, and in this scene shoos them away. He's not much help, and the boisterous group, they've been drinking, of course, although it's before lunch, inadvertently find the medieval equivalent of what the English call a blue badge guide, so someone who's knowledgeable and trained, a guide around a church. After praying to St. Thomas as best they can, this goodly monk, this guide, takes them in hand and tells them the names of the martyred saints whose relics they have just kissed. He then leads them around to other places of holiness, most likely the place where death came to the archbishop, and the places where Thomas's tomb crown and cloak were displayed. After their tour, the monk calms them down, and they maintain devout continences until the service concludes. This comical scene might be only slightly exaggerated and shows us that even semi-literate oglers benefited from tutorial intervention. In fact, medieval guides to the Holy Land, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and the book of Marjorie Kemp, which covers her English travels, tell us that pilgrims regularly contracted with local clergy or friars. Some of these intermediaries, like modern museum docents, had what are called belt books, small little books that they wore on their belts that contained information about the sites. Indeed, it is remarkable, as Jean Crocalis has written, how often pilgrim narratives and miracle stories mention groups accompanied by a chaplain. And so early on, church men functioned, they're all men, functioned as guides to and around sacred sites, drawing information from these belt books, preaching extemporaneously, and using on-site tabulae, tablets, informational signage to help church visitors orient and inform themselves. We have 11th century records of tablets like these being used in churches at Seaford and Bury St. Edmunds in England. This is a short list that gives you some indication, some idea of their geographical spread across England and in the kinds of churches that use them. Unfortunately, most of these no longer exist. All we have is records and manuscripts that say there were tables, there were tablets in many of the churches. It's an early list, like I said, mostly recounts 11th century tablets. And like English world maps, like the ones I'm interested in, tabulae really didn't proliferate until the end of the 13th and 14th centuries. The records for these things are really spotty, and there really aren't any to look at, so I can't show you any pictures of the real things. I have some pictures I'll show you of a different kind of tablet, but the ones I'm interested in are pretty much all gone. Hereford Cathedral had its map, of course, but it also had tablets, the records tell us, decorated with gold and gems, one showing Christ and Mary. The cathedral records show that these tablets were located near Thomas Cantilupe's second tomb in the cathedral's Lady Chapel, and that around 1550, agents of the Reformation spirited them away. I'm pretty sure they went to the Tower of London, which was the treasury, which was the repository for lots of these precious church goods that Henry VIII had pulled out of all these buildings. They went there, and there are records of them in the Tower of London, but for the most part, nobody knows where the stuff went. It's really frustrating. Some monumental tablets survive, like Glastonbury's, like this one, Glastonbury Abbey, which is in the central England. Glastonbury Abbey's so-called Magna Tabula, big tablet, which measures about 3 by 1.5 feet and is in the Bodleian Library. This thing is really quite amazing. I got to spend a few days with it a few years ago. It's parchment written on and painted, and it's just glued to big oak panels. And it's got massive handmade hinges on the back. When you turn it, it makes a really loud creaking noise. So I was doing this in the library, and every time I did it, people would go, shh, shh. What am I supposed to do? WD-40. Here is a lengthy description, not mine, by a woman called Jean Crocalis, description of the Glastonbury tablet. York Minster in the far north of England has two large triptych, three-part tablets, which are 56 inches by 35 and 45 by 27 in its library. I have yet to go see those. And there's one survivor from Old St. Paul's in London in the British Library, which I'm going to look at this summer. These survivors aside, most tablets have disappeared, and so my short list is, well, woefully short. The great majority were wooden and portable and thus made for grand Protestant bonfires. Their vestiges live on, of course, in our modern galleries and museums with their exhibit cards fixed to walls near artworks and in the many medieval churches that now attract mostly tourists of the secular sort. Settling on a definition, a useful definition of tabula is more difficult than describing the things themselves and a bit like trying to define map. I have a list of over 300 definitions of the word map, M-A-P, little tiny word, 300 definitions. So here's a selection of some relevant definitions of tabula or tablet. Suffice it to say that a tabula or a tablet, a table, was a flat, non-mural surface, so not a wall surface, upon which were painted or sculpted words and or images, or to which painted parchment was attached. Think of the Hereford Map glued to its backboard. The plural, tabulae, also noted sets of tablets tied or hinged together as diptychs, so two folding doors, or triptychs, three-part, which often featured hinged wings that were kept closed for Lent. So here's one. This is from the cloisters in New York City, 14th century. This is alabaster, carved alabaster. The English were really well known for carved alabaster. This one is at the Victorian Albert Museum in London. It's 14th century. It shows the coronation of the Virgin and was done for the King of England. And then this one is also from the V&A, Victorian Albert, and it's an Annunciation triptych. You can see the top part of the carving is missing. It's all wood, and it's really quite miraculous that it still survives. They would close the doors for Lent. They did the same thing on the Hereford Map. They would close the wings to cover up the map in the church. From the mid-14th century, tabulae like these with alabaster carving or of scenes from the Passion or the Life of the Virgin were really popular. Some were freestanding, like this one. Others were used as altarpieces, and according to Francis Cheetham, represent a distinctly English variation of this characteristic late medieval form. Single panel tabulae were mounted as altar frontals or panels on altars, as memorials to people who'd passed, or as flat surfaces upon which church laws or doctrine were inscribed. They were stationed as decoration and incitement to devotion and edification at key sites like shrines and tombs and near church windows that told stories, so narrative windows. Abbot Suger in the 11th century discovered the necessity of intervening with explanatory tabulae in his church to prevent the kind of untutored gawping we see in the tale of Baron. Suger's Saint-Denis was the Royal Abbey in Paris. It's the first Gothic building, and it really was astounding. Most of it is gone now, but Suger adorned it with stained glass windows, all of which told stories, mostly biblical stories. Gold everywhere. There's a record of a golden cross that he had on the main altar that was something like 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide. Really amazing. So it was a huge, it attracted lots of people. So he was worried that people were going to misinterpret or not get the point of all the things that he installed in his church. He also wrote his name all over the church. Everywhere it says Fecit Suger, done by Suger, everywhere on all the windows and all the big ego. So he installed verbal descriptions near all the marbles in his basilica, like the rear panel on the main altar. This is on the back of the altar, which nobody sees. He claimed that this panel, quote, couldn't be understood easily through visual examination, that it couldn't be understood without a verbal description, so he provided one. This is because its image, he wrote, discloses its meanings only to the literate and shines with the radiance of delightful allegories. And so he writes, in order that these allegories might be clearly understood, I affixed verses explaining them. The odd thing is that Suget's explanations for these allegories are no clearer than the allegories themselves. So I'm with Suget and Jean Crocalis, who understands that anyone who's ever stood perplexed before a window filled with panels depicting the miracles of a saint can appreciate how useful a guide such tablets could have been. Most surviving textual tabulae, tablets with words on, are just accounts of the foundations, local history, and documents of a church, which would be useful in disputes about ecclesiastical authority. They functioned as a permanent reference works that were always available for consultation to the clergy. York Minster, way in the north of England's tabulae are of this type. They presented a collection of chronicles of the world, chronicles of England, the history of England, of the minster, of the church, and copies of papal grants and bulls, so instructions from the Vatican. In 1534, John Leland observed that they were for pilgrims and visitors seeking information about the minster and who came to marvel, he said, at the antiquity of the great temple of York. In 1967, Canon John Stanley Purvis, I love this, wrote that the tablets were hung up in the minster for the study of the vicars, who were then quizzed on their content. That's great. All these priests sitting around with little Scantron sheets. In other words, these tablets were displayed and used by clergy and inquisitive laity who needed a verbal description of what they were seeing. Tablets drew the faithful closer to the buildings, housing them into the cosmic narrative of which those versions of built history were chapters. Okay, so now back to the map, to the Hereford Map, which I'm happy to think of as a monumental tablet that provided some clergy and visitors with a complex, legible account of human history that was then spoken for those who couldn't read by a guide. Currently, so this is the chain library in Hereford Cathedral. They reassembled it in the mid-90s, 1994, 95. It has all the original, they're called book presses, the shelves, the reading tables and the benches. The books, as you can see, literally were chained to iron bars that ran across the shelves so that nobody could remove them from the room. They let you read these if you're, I've read some of these things, but they don't let anybody in the room with a key. They have to go fetch them for you. Currently, the map isn't in its original north transept location in the cathedral, but it's on display next to the chain library, which is significant. During opening hours, a local volunteer stands near the map ready to answer visitors' questions, reminding us of the tale of Baron's helpful monk. Visitors today are more sober and better behaved than the people in the tale of Baron. This is a horrible picture for which I apologize, but it's the best one I have. This is what the map display looks like now. It's in a hermetically sealed, environmentally something case. It's really terrible. You can't really see the map. But there is always somebody standing next to it to answer questions for visitors. There is, however, an image of the map in the north transept here on the top left, which was refurbished in 2008. Here you can see the map painted on the western gable of the new canopy for St. Thomas Cantilupe's first tomb shrine. So the red canopy on the left, this is the front face of it on the left of that picture. And the dean and chapter of the cathedral had a different picture up there, and then they decided that the map actually was in that part of the church, so they decided to remove that picture, and put one there of the map, which is kind of nice. This elaborate complex, which is almost Anglo-Catholic in its exuberance, also contains a relic of the saint, a bit of his shin bone, in a new crystalline reliquary. So up on the right is the crystalline reliquary, and right in the middle of it is a little container with a piece of St. Thomas Cantilupe's shin bone, which is about as big as my thumbnail. It also has a new altar, new tapestries telling the bishop's life story. To guide visitors through the complex and to explain the presence of the map there, that image, The dean and chapter of the cathedral installed these illustrated panels, which I like to think of as neo-medieval tablets for modern pilgrims. And along with these panels, there are volunteer docents and cathedral clergy on duty to help visitors. In its modern display, then, the map looks nothing like the tablets I've shown you. However, if we go back to this, which is John Carter's 1780 sketch of the map, we see its striking resemblance. This is the only visual evidence we have of what the map originally looked like in its three-part case. It's the only evidence we have that it had the Annunciation painted on the inside of the two doors. The doors have disappeared. So this is really important. In design, materials, and decoration, the encased Hereford map wouldn't have looked unusual to medieval visitors used to seeing these other folding tablets, size aside perhaps. Its cabinet was designed during the period when winged altarpieces were common in Northern Europe, that is around 1300, and was carved in the dominant Gothic style, as this sketch shows us. Meant to mimic the look of the building in which it was displayed, elaborate moldings and a central finial, the pointy thing in the middle, were attached to its gabled backing panel, all of which were colorfully painted to set off the lettered and painted map at the cabinet's center. So unfortunately, it's just a very rough, quick sketch of the map in the center, but it clearly is the very same map. And then some really interesting little annotations by Carter around the edges. We see similar embellishments here on the original central panel of the map, which was found in 1989 in what were at one time the cathedral stables. It was just shoved in a corner. So this is from about 1300. It's made out of oak from around Hereford Cathedral, so it's local wood. The crockets at the top probably aren't medieval. For a while, people thought they were Victorian, so 19th century, but they're much older than that. They've done really serious dendrochronological dating of the panel, but they haven't done it of the decorative parts. I don't know why. So the panel is definitely sort of 1290 to 1310, for sure. And right in the center, you can't see it here, is a hole from, it's clear that the map was drawn while it was attached to this thing, because there's a hole in the center of this which exactly matches the central hole in the map, which they used to anchor the compass that they drew the circles with. It's pretty cool. Yeah, stables. The doors have gone missing. Nobody knows where they are. So in construction and design, the map in triptych on this panel with the doors would have been seen as a big tabula, a magna tabula by visitors and cathedral clergy who would have used it as such. To bolster that contention, we can think of Merton College, Oxford, which also had one of these world maps, and which the college records refer to as a tabula. This map, hung on the wall in the library where lectures were given and where it would have been used to illustrate readings and lectures. Tellingly, the first record of the Hereford map dates to 1684 and puts it in the cathedral's Lady Chapel, which was then the cathedral library, and the area of the building devoted to the Virgin. Here, clergy would have used the encyclopedic map to complement their readings and lectures as students did at Merton. Although the map would have fit nicely into the cathedral's decorative program, its size, content, placement, and presentation would have set it apart. It would not have been, in other words, just part of the furniture in what was a very crowded house. At nearly 9 feet wide, so we go back to this, when it's open, the map would have been a marvel among marvels. As it does today, we know that medieval cathedral had custodes, churchmen, positioned around the building to guide visitors and to keep an eye on its treasures. It seems reasonable to assume that these custodes led pilgrims on tours of the building of the church and perhaps closed with a look at the map, which we know had a custos, a custodian, assigned to keep an eye on it. There was a wooden perch built about 8-9 feet in the air, and he stood up there and looked down on the thing so nobody could mess with it. It's easy to envision a guide heightening the crowd's anticipation as they toured the church and the wondrousness of the guide's reveal as he dramatically opened the doors to its fantastical world, rather like Lucy Pevensey opening the cabinet doors to the wonders of Narnia. Unlike Suger's tablets at Saint-Denis or those in Glastonbury Abbey, Hereford's Map Tabula doesn't explain doctrinal matters or provide church or local history. Its apocalyptic program is concerned with higher things. Like the cathedral, the map represents and points to grander events, nothing less than the creation of the human race and its history, running from the expulsion to the history of the future, which its last judgment images forth. So this is the top of the map, the neck. The Hereford map's unique in giving this scene primacy of place. I want to zoom in on this key intercessory scene and the Virgin's role in it by way of wrapping up today. So the doom, as the judgment scene is called, is the map's most important vignette. In it, the Virgin kneels to address her son, not the viewer. So the Virgin, so this is Christ, this is the Virgin. Over here is an angel leading souls to heaven, and you can't see it on here, but over here there is a demon with a pitchfork shoveling a bunch of souls into hell. It's much more interesting on that side. The Virgin speaks Anglo-Norman, Old French, not Latin, which is unusual. All the inscriptions except for a few on the map are in Latin, which was the language of the church, which suggests that this precursor of modern French was the language of heaven, because her son understands it. Reading her speech scrolls would have pulled Britain's thousands of Anglo-Norman speakers close to her supplication in a deeply personal way, reinforcing their faith in her unique intercessory powers. The image of the Virgin as humanity's supreme intermediary was the central component of her cult. It was common in early Byzantine art and right through the Middle Ages, appearing in all media and in hymns like the 4 liturgical Marian antiphons. From the mid-12th to the 13th centuries, the Virgin starred in countless miracle tales written by men like Dominic of Yves Chamabi, William of Malmesbury, and most famously French author Gautier de Coincy. There are 14th century trial narratives. So Judgment Day is a trial, it's a court setting. And there are 14th century stories about it, one called the Processus Belial, which is written in Latin, and another called L'Advocatie Notre Dame, which is in Old French, that pit the Virgin as heavenly defender of human souls against the diabolical prosecutor. She always wins. Her supplication on the Hereford map, her prayer, which is here in these speech scrolls, going upward toward her son. Her supplication is part of a tradition and recalls, there we go, there she is, and recalls other advocational Marian prayers like this one, which at the bottom, which is called the miracle of the infant given to the devil. So the map's doom, its judgment, announces the salvific power and necessity of the Virgin's mediation by figuring her as the Mater Mediatrix, humanity's mediating mother, and as the Maria Lactans, the nursing mother. So she, as in the Marian tales, the map's humbly tenacious advocate argues her case in the court over which her son presides by baring her breasts. Get this blue circle here. By baring her breasts and reminding him that she nourished him, that her breasts nourished him. The Maria Lactans plays on Christ's love and compassion for her and through her for all Christians. Through her pathetic posture and verbal supplication, she exemplifies the ultimate truth. Anyone who is her devotee and has lived what St. Augustine called the good life can expect eternal residency in the New Jerusalem. As ever, she wins the battle for souls. So she literally, on the map, rips open her robe and shows her son her breast. She does that a lot in stories. I offer her vignette as the prime image of intermediation, as the epitome of the entire enterprise enacted by the church building. Its decorative program, furnishings, and human translators, in short, all the elements that initiated and schooled medieval visitors in the marvels within. The Virgin's first joy, the Annunciation, covered the map's world. so it was on the doors. It enabled the incarnation and the crucifixion, both of which the map represents in images, and she stars in its most important scene. Recognizing her seminal role in Christian history, the fact that Hereford Cathedral is dedicated to her, and the fact that the map was originally displayed near her devotee bishop's tomb shrine takes me back to my opening thoughts on uprooting and the need for multifaceted recontextualization of artifacts like this map. And so, if we mentally remove the map from its new and inappropriate case, refix it to its original triptych mentally, replace it in the church for which it was made, consider its role as a great tablet, and situate the church among 800 some medieval churches devoted to the Virgin, and then situate those churches in the tradition of Marian architecture, music, painting, poetry, prayer, sculpture, we'll have a better understanding of how this marvel among marvels functioned as a translator among translators, pointing the faithful toward the bejeweled city of God. So, lots of work still to do. Thanks for coming.